Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone this morning. It's a beautiful, cool, but not super cold morning here in Alabama. Just finished getting back from milking the cow and doing a few of the chores. Good to see everyone today. Cora, Betsy, Mary Ann, William, good morning. Yep, we've got the chat there on the side. Feel free to use that during the session this morning. We had a fun time last night, had a little kind of after party chat. A few people sharing about what they were doing after the main class last night. So we'll see if we get to do that again today. But during our main session, we'll just use the chat on the side for any questions or comments. That would be awesome. It's great to get your feedback. Today, we are going to be continuing through the lessons in the Well Water Garden Handbook. And just today is going to be a lot of the practical ones. So yesterday, we talked a lot about the kind of the vision for the well water garden, how we want it to be a tool that allows us to express the humility, faithfulness, and unselfishness of Jesus, and do that in a way that helps fix the or addresses a lot of the problems in agriculture that we face. Let's see here. My Bible just started playing. That's nice.
She has prepared her meat and
Sorry about that. Yeah, so it's a tool for us to be able to not only learn how to live out the heart of Jesus in what we're doing in a garden, but to be able to share that with others and learn how to be more natural in the way that we share our faith. We talked about kind of the multiplication aspect of it, where we want to have this vision of simple systems that we can duplicate easily to help people get started quickly, rather than having to reinvent the wheel from scratch every time. So a well-watered garden is not like the only or best way to garden, or if it's like, if you love Jesus, you'll do it this way, and if you don't do it this way, then you must not love Jesus or something. That's not it at all. The idea is that it's just a way to practice and to learn how a biblical worldview and the heart of Jesus impacts the way that we do things. So we went over some of the heart lessons yesterday about how to do introductions, how to talk about the worldview issue and what the real root of the problems we face in agriculture are, what some of those problems are. And then the story, Brian Oldreive's story, which is the background of Foundations for Farming and the principles behind the well water garden, where you can share those in a story format, which is really one of the ways Jesus taught. So today we're going to be going through, again, some of the practical things. And as we get started here and people are still trickling in, I would love it if you are able to get in the chat there and jot down what's one of your takeaways from yesterday. If you joined us for the class yesterday, pop in the chat there and type what's something that was a takeaway for you from the sessions yesterday, while we are continuing to let people join us here. Yeah. Sonia says the heart of the matter. That was definitely. Janet said pick one system and follow it to high standards. Yep. Definitely something. When I first started, I was doing a little bit of a lot of things and didn't do anything really well. There's actually a principle in disciple making. It comes from learning systems and like following uh, things in when you're learning, like disciple making or other things like that. The idea is you have education or learning about stuff, application, and innovation. And we want to go from education, application to innovation, not education, innovation to application, which is what we often tend to do. So sin affects my relationship with the soil, and Jesus, like everything else, redeems it. Marianne said, that's great. This is a system, not legalistic. Yep. And we're confirming God's heart for agriculture with scriptures, keeping it simple, prayer and being okay not to know it all, the ready use of the material, awesome. People can still see Jesus in the basic lessons even when they're not using the faith foundations. Yes. And the importance of asking, what does God or Jesus think about what I'm trying to do in the garden? Yep. It's one of those things that it seems like a duh to say maybe we should ask God about how we garden, but it's so easy to go to Google instead of to prayer. You know, not that Google's necessarily bad to look at answers for to, but if we aren't really we can sometimes say that we're praying or saying that we're asking the Lord and we're actually not. So really important to have that. Corbin says humility, faithfulness, and unselfishness, love the heart foundation. It's great. Loving the updates to the manual. Heart is the key. Awesome. A lot of great takeaways from yesterday. I'm glad it seems like y'all are really capturing the heart of what I'm trying to communicate. It's my heart. So that's awesome. So it looks like we got quite a few people here, and really grateful for that. So we're going to go ahead and get started with just a bit of worship, getting our heart on the Lord again this morning. I'm going to read a passage from Matthew, the end of the Sermon on the Mount, about the wise and the foolish builders. And just as we get started here. So Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 says, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." What always amazes me about this this parable is that the difference between the wise and foolish builders wasn't what they heard. It says that they both heard the words of Jesus, but one of them obeyed them and applied them, and one of them didn't. And I think it's really convicting when I realize that that's the really the what God's looking for is not just how much I know, but how much I apply of the things that He's invested. I think the blessing of the words that I've heard of Jesus. You know, real faith is accompanied by action. You can say that you believe in eating organic, but if you don't, do you really believe it, right? Or you can say Ford makes the best car, but if you drive a Toyota, you know, I mean, do you really believe it? So the idea is like Jesus is looking for us to apply. And so that's where I really encourage you is your training, that you don't just take all your time thinking that you're succeeding in training somebody else by giving them just a bunch of information, but that you really take time to focus on application and helping them think through what they're going to do, give them opportunities to do that, and challenging them to do that, because it's better to give them a little bit of information that they apply than a lot that they don't. And that's would be true for doing, you know, Bible studies or anything like that. But We want to be evaluating how much am I obeying of what I already heard, have already heard. It's easy to get into that. I'm always learning, and never going and doing anything. So I'm going to really encourage you by the end of today to be thinking about what are 1, 2, or 3 steps that you can take in response to what you've learned. We don't always have like the entire roadmap of what God wants us to do, but we almost always have the next step or 1 or 2 things that we can do in response. Talk to somebody, take this, do this project, adjust this in our life. And that's what I'm really wanting you to think about as we're going through this. What does God want me to do as a result, as the first steps? Because he doesn't want to waste your time invested in coming to this training, or any of our time. He wants that to impact your life so that it can impact others' lives. And that may be something completely different. I mean, I had my friend, one of my friends that came to one of our first trainings. I remember we went to the application and we had talked all about the gardening and all that, but a lot about the heart. And at the end, his application was, I really want to go do a garden at some point, but I feel like my first step is to go back and work on my relationship with my wife. So sometimes it's something completely, different that you don't think, but we're wanting God to speak to us what those things are he wants us to take as next steps. All right. Let's just, I'm just going to sing the first verse of Amazing Grace because God's grace is so amazing. And we want to just to appreciate that and appreciate how much we've been given. And so we'll just start with that, pray, and then get right into the lessons. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Lord, I just thank you for today, and I just pray that you would please just show us how amazing you are. Show us, Lord, how we can see what it is that you see, Lord, that you can open our eyes to a fuller understanding of your truth and a greater faith to go and obey and apply it, Lord God. Direct my words, help me to spend our time wisely, and just give us wisdom and more of your presence today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we are going to be going through some of the practical lessons in the Wellwater Garden Handbook. So for those of you who may not be familiar with it, the Wellwater Garden Handbook is just the resource that we've created to make it really easy for you to teach this tool and teach others to teach it as well. So we're going to go over, I'm going to share my screen. And if you didn't get to watch the lessons from yesterday, we will have the recordings for those. So I encourage you to go back and check those out because we talk a little bit about the design and stuff of the handbook and how it's laid out. But today we're going to get right into the lessons. Here we go. Okay, so over here we're going to be starting with lesson 4 today. So the first 3 lessons are really about the heart. This is really getting into lessons for changing how we think about agriculture in light of the heart that we talked about yesterday. So this is the basic student lesson where we're going to go through first, and then we'll go and talk about the faith foundation for soils and plowing. For those of you that weren't here yesterday, the way we have the handbook laid out, we have basic student lessons that are written for a general audience, even if they're not Christians. And then we have a faith foundation that goes with each lesson if you're able to teach the scriptural side of things or if you're teaching church groups. So this is the basic lesson. We are going the goal of this is to really think about how God has designed the soil. If we're going to be working the land, we're going to be growing stuff, we need to understand how the soil works and think about that. So let me hide that. Here we have the first activity that we typically do is we take people out into someplace in the woods or the bush that's undisturbed, and we want them to just look at it, to just get down and to look at the forest, just like Brian Oldreeve did when he went out and asked God how to farm. This beautiful quote from George Washington Carver says, "Reading about nature is fine, but if a person walks in the woods and listens carefully, he can learn more than what is in books." And I think the rest of the quote says, "For they speak with the words of God." So we go and we encourage them to go out themselves and just take a little walk and go down, scrape back the leaves, think about what they're seeing there and how that might contrast with a normal garden. And then we come back and we talk about the three major components of healthy soil after we kind of hear from them, like, what did you see? And typically they all fall into some of these major categories here. And we just, soil science is one of those amazing things that you can really geek out about, because the biology of the soil and how it works, we're just really almost, it's like a new frontier of learning about this stuff. But we want to keep it super, super simple so people can understand it. So we just explain how there's three major unique components of healthy soil. One is minerals, which are dead things that were never alive. Two is organic matter, dead things that used to be alive, and microorganisms, living things that are still alive. And then we talk about those different ones, like the minerals that might be in your area, sand, silt, and clay. Talk about the organic matter, the decomposed stuff, and how that helps hold the soil together. And then the microorganisms, the bacteria. And what we normally talk about here with the different microorganisms, we like to say we have bacteria and fungi are the two major ones we want to talk about, even though there are a lot of other organisms in the soil as well, because when we talk about compost, these are going to be pertinent. And we like to mention that bacteria have a sweet tooth. They like to eat sugar, and they also need nitrogen to reproduce and grow. And the reason that we want to talk about those is because later we'll say this is why we need those in our compost pile, because we want to breed bacteria. And then the fungi here, they like to eat woody organic matter. And that's why we're going to put that in our compost pile when we're doing that. But it's important to mention these because it's helpful to refer to them later. And then we want to talk about the structure of healthy soil and how it's not just a list of components, just like my house is not just a list of building materials. It's also got structure that makes it useful, because a tornado could come along and collapse my house. And if it may be the same list of materials, but it's not going to be quite as useful to me as it is if it had the structure that it currently has, right? So soil is the same way. It's not just a list of components. It's also got a way that it's set up. And the simple way we talk about it when we go and look at the soil is we say the minerals tend to be down deep below. The organic matter is being applied on the top by the plants and everything that are dropping leaves and stuff. And then in between where they blend is where some of the major microbial activity is, where the organic matter, all the leaves and decaying stuff meet the sand or clay underneath. And you kind of have that activity zone of feeding by the bacteria and the fungi and stuff. And that's where most of the food is produced in the soil. You'll see a lot of the feeder roots. So it's a strata, it's a layered system, not just this blended homogeneous potting soil if you look in natural creation. So we want to talk about how that they're organized that way. We also talk just about, so then as we talk about the importance of that soil structure, then we're going to talk about and ask, and we'll evaluate our normal way of approaching preparing a garden by plowing. Because we think the reason we plow is because we think it's helping out the soil and making it better and looser and fluffier and all that, killing weeds, incorporating all that organic matter and allowing the water to permeate down into it. And yet when we refer back to the story of Brian Oldreive when he was plowing and did not have any mulch on the ground. He was losing money on his farm, and when he just applied those two principles of keeping a mulch and minimally disturbing the soil, they had a huge impact. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, this is one of the experiments that that was later done to show in this plowed field here, when rain, 63 millimeters or 2.5 inches of rain was applied in 30 minutes, 90% of it ran off of the plowed and unmulched field, and only 10% infiltrated. But on the field that was mulched with no plowing, only 6% ran off and over 94% infiltrated. And that's just talking about water infiltration. There's a lot of other benefits that go along as well. But what we're trying to do, what we want to do with this lesson here is not so much try to demonize plowing per se. We want to talk about how it can be detrimental, but we want to showcase the amazing design of God's soil and just challenge the typical way that we approach preparing it. Because if we are like, man, this is such an amazing system, how it's all laid out, and then we say, well, why are we doing this? Does it really help? And rather than talk about it too much, one of the best ways to do this is to do the soil demonstrations. We have up here, reasons for plowing, like all these reasons we tip to plow and what the real impact has. But before we even do this lesson, a lot of times what we will do are some soil demonstrations just to let people see this in real life, because it will it will show them a lot better than you talking about it. And so I'm going to stop this share actually and pull up a quick couple minutes of a video of these soil demonstrations just so that you can see them if you haven't seen them before. Okay. Can you guys see that? Okay, great. All right, here we go.
Soil demonstrations. Splash demo. In this demonstration, we are using two small identical plates of soil. The soil is loose, as it would be if it were in a plowed field. We cover one of the plates with a layer of mulch, and then direct a strong jet of water at each plate in turn. What we see is an exaggerated effect of raindrops hitting the soil as they fall from the sky. On the exposed plate, there is a lot of soil disturbance as the soil and water is thrown out of the plate onto the paper beneath it. There is also a marked slumping or compaction evident where the water hit the soil. The other plate, which had the mulch, is very different. And here we see how important it is to have a cover over our soil to protect it from this primary form of erosion. Infiltration demo. We would now like to show you that one of the primary factors influencing why we plow is in fact untrue. The belief is that if we loosen the soil, it will allow for better water infiltration. We've created two funnels. One contains fine soil, as would be seen in a plowed field or a seedbed situation. The second contains soil which has been disturbed as little as possible after being dug from a virgin area of undisturbed soil. When we pour equal volumes of water onto these two funnels, it is very evident that the fine, disturbed soil does not allow for water infiltration. While in the undisturbed soil, there is very rapid infiltration. The reason why the water does not infiltrate is that the soil structure has been broken down into very fine particles. These particles actually form an impervious layer preventing water penetration, and upon drying, create a very hard, compact layer known as capping. Clod demo. A very visual experiment which can be conducted to show the importance of not disturbing the soil structure through plowing is the clod demonstration. Here we take two clods of similar soil type, one from a plowed field and the second from an undisturbed area. Visually, the clods are very different. It can be noticed that the clod from the plowed area is definitely harder and has fewer pore spaces. When these two clods are placed into a jar of water, it is a general expectation that the harder clod will be more resilient to the water. Amazingly though, as you can see, it is quite the opposite, with the softer, easily broken clod being totally unaffected by contact with water. Thus, as we disturb soil through conventional farming practices, we are actually destroying the natural ability for soil to withstand erosion. Runoff demo. In the final demonstration, we prepared two trays in an identical manner. Firstly, placing a layer of stones, and then a layer of sand, and finally, a layer of topsoil. Then on one of the trays, we place a layer of grass. It should be noted that both soils are equivalent to plowed soil. Each tray has a jar to catch both the runoff water and the infiltrated water. Water is poured to simulate rain and is applied as evenly as possible to both trays. In a very short space of time, water begins to flow off the unprotected tray. This water also carries a large volume of soil with it. The mulched tray has very little runoff, meaning the water should be infiltrating. This is soon very evident as water begins to flow into the jar placed to catch the infiltration. When the jars of runoff water are compared and the water poured out, we are able to see the difference of the eroded soil between the two.
All right. So hopefully you were able to see and hear that. That video is available on the website or on Redeeming the Dirt. I think it's on YouTube as well. But doing them hands-on, as you can see, what we're just doing here is we're testing mulch versus no mulch, plow versus not plow, to just kind of test those two principles that we're talking about and let people decide for themselves kind of some of the impacts there of compared to what we think we're doing with the soil. And it's a lot of fun with kids as well. I'm going to share a few pictures here of, yeah. So these are some of the students that we've been teaching, and it's fun to see them as they're doing these demonstrations and them guessing what's going to be the effect. Here's some of our students from the summer doing their kind of presentation to the parents and staff and helping them put together the soil demos. And you can see there, we just used some old office water bottle coolers for the runoff trays. And they did a great job with it, had a lot of fun doing the splash pan demos and practicing ahead of time. Curious about why the water doesn't go down the plowed funnel. So really encourage you to, if you haven't done these before, to practice them and try them out, because it's a really great way. A lot of times when you're in the class and you're coming up to this point in time, you haven't had a whole lot of hands-on stuff. You know, maybe you've gone out into the woods and you've tried to look at the design of the soil, but this is one of the first real practical things that you can do to give yourself some hands-on stuff for people to be involved in. All right, let's go back to our manual here. So for sake of time today, I'm going to try to hit the highlights of some of the different lessons so that we have enough time. But the one thing I wanted to highlight here from the Faith Foundations for this particular lesson is, what about plowing in the Bible? All right, because let's see. Yeah. Doesn't the Bible talk about plowing, right? So especially if you're talking to Christians, it's a good, question to be able to answer or talk about. And so what I normally just say here is the Bible definitely talks about plowing. But what we're talking about in this lesson is different than the plowing talked about in the Bible, as far as I know. So the verse about beating your swords into plowshares implies that the plows in the Bible were pointed and only disturbed the soil to a shallow depth to allow for seeding, as you can see in this picture of an Egyptian plow from biblical time. And really, even in my area, until these kind of plows in a lot of parts of rural Alabama were used instead of moldboard plows. And this is similar. Like, this is not, if you can see, it's not inverting the soil. It's not flipping it upside down, and it's not pulverizing it to 6 inches. It's just loosening it up for a seed bed, similar to the way that animal hooves would, or something, if they come into, or birds scratching in the woods. The destructive plowing or tilling we're talking about is deep inversion tillage, where the soil is flipped upside down, all the layers are mixed up, and it's pulverized into that, loose plowed soil that we think of as really nice. And really, this has only been possible on a large scale in recent centuries with moldboard turning plow and mechanical tillers. So it was not something that people were really able to do until recently. And so minimal soil disturbance is what we're talking about. Trying to just to disturb your soil is part of managing it to a degree. But if you understand those layers and how those are beneficial, and how the structure of the soil is really wonderful and valuable, then you're not going to disturb it for the sake of trying to, because you think that pulverizing it to 8 inches is helping it. Does that make sense? If you have to dig to plant something, no big deal. The soil is resilient, but you're not pulverizing the entire plot just for the sake of doing that. So anyways, just wanted to, the same thing. We're just showcasing man's ways versus God's ways. We don't want to tell our neighbor down the street just because they till their garden that they don't love Jesus as much as we do. That is not the point here. But the idea is to showcase God's ways versus man's ways. And again, the scripture talks about everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. So we want to be open to, even though God may allow certain things, that we want to appreciate and utilize his wisdom and grow in our ability to do that. So that is the lesson on soils and plowing, which hopefully will change some people's perspectives on why we're going to do the garden the way that we are, but hopefully it will also open their mind to just asking the same question in other areas of life. What does my father do? How can I see what he does, whether it's in health or it's in any other area of our life, marriage and relationships, those kind of things. So our next lesson is profitable management. And I am going to go to the Faith Foundations for this one first. Sorry for I know that it's probably a little dizzying to watch me scroll through this, but here we go. So to be faithful managers is really an important key of implementing methods, because the methodology is really only as successful as we faithfully implement it. And so often we can take a good method, and if we apply it poorly, it's still not going to work. And it's not the method's fault. It's actually the implementers or the manager's fault. So we want to do what we do faithfully and well. And so in this particular Faith Foundation, we're going to be talking about the idea of faithfulness, the parable of the talents, the importance of generosity, and stewardship. And so a lot of this has to do with a lot of this is important when we talk about poverty and helping people that are poor, with evaluating what is the root of our poverty, And it's easy to think that it's a lack of resources, but what we want to show in this particular lesson is that resources is not, a lack of resources is an evidence of unfaithfulness and selfishness, whether on a small scale or a more complex, broader scale in a community. Because when Brian Oldreive asked God, why is Africa so poor? He said he felt like God told him it was a violation of 2 biblical principles that apply to every nation, community, and family. First of all, if you're unfaithful, God will take away from you. That's a biblical principle. Even if you're not a Christian, that's true. And also, if you're faithful with little, he will add to you. And that's from the parable of the talents. And if you're selfish, he'll also take away from you. The idea of as you measure, it will be measured to you. And if you're generous, then he will add to you. So when he was looking at a lot of Africa as a whole, the not being faithful with the land, the first thing given to them, and the kind of being the begging bowl, those are the things that he felt like God wanted him to go, is teach faithfulness, teach generosity. And then that's what God's looking for to add profit to. That's what he wants. He will add to that faithfulness. So rather than helping people by just giving them more resources, which can be important if it's a crisis situation, but if it's just a development, trying to help them come out of poverty, what we want to do is teach them that profit, or producing more than you consume, is a fruit of faithfulness. One thing that is we really all enjoy at our trainings, if we're able to do it, is we have people act out the parable of the talents. And always a fun thing at the end, down at the, let's see, oh, here it is, on I think after the Faith Foundations, there's actually a drama here. I think Brian Oldry put this together, and had permission from his manual to use this. So this is kind of like a little, skit that you can put together, or that you can just assign everybody a part, and they can read their parts and act it out. And it's a lot of fun, especially when you get to the end and everybody gets to throw the unfaithful servant out into the darkness. That's pretty dramatic often, when everybody grabs one of the students and throws them out the door. But it's really an important principle to be like, to ask, what is it that that the master was looking for? He wasn't evaluating them based on just how much they had, but whether they were faithful with what they had. And then we want to talk about that idea of measuring generously. God is looking for us to reflect his abundance in the way that we share with others, and in the way that we share with the land. And so this Luke 6:38, given it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And that's another reason I really encourage you guys to think about, if you always want to do a smaller plot, you want to focus on a small area when you're growing, because what that does is, not only does it help you to, be able to start small and work bigger, but it allows you to be generous to that piece of land. When we try to grow too much, too big, we're like stretching our resources, our focus, our time over a large area, and we're kind of being stingy to every square foot of that garden. But if we have a smaller garden, I always have the most productive gardens when they're small, because I'm able to be generous to them. And then the 4 management principles that Brian Oldreive learned to teach to the poor in order to help them to make a profit with these methods was to do things on time, to a high standard, with minimal waste, and with joy. And these are just a reflection of who God is. So in this Faith Foundation, we're talking about, how these are biblical principles. On time, God is a God of seasons and order and timeliness. We know that from Ecclesiastes, talking about there's a time for everything. The sluggard does not plow in season, so at harvest time he looks but finds nothing. And then to a high standard, God is a God of excellence. He wants us to do things with all of our heart. He loves attention to detail. I mean, if you don't think God loves attention to detail, you should read some of the Old Testament. By the time you get to the tabernacle or some of these other things, the detail there is very precise. He's not like, generally build a building. He loves the detail. And so he loves it when we pay attention to details as well, because it reflects who he is. And then with minimal waste, God is a God who loves to recycle things, and even people, which I'm really grateful for. He didn't just chuck me out when I was broken. He recycled me, and is using me as a new person. So we see this even reflected in Jesus after he fed the 5,000. He told the disciples to pick up all the pieces that were left over so they weren't wasted, even though it's like there was a bunch. What you can make some more tomorrow, but the key is everything that he's made is valuable. There's value to everything he has made, and he wants us to not waste the water that he gives us, or the soil, or the opportunities, or anything. And then the joy, I think, is one of the most important things. We often, in trying to do things for the Lord, we lose our joy. But joy is really the natural result of doing things on time to a high standard and with minimal waste. If you go out and your garden's planted late, it's crooked and not looking very good, and all your soil's washing away, and your plants are it robs you of your joy and demotivates you to go out there and do it. But if you go out there and you planted, you got your garden ready on time, you planted exactly on the best dates, the rows are beautiful and straight, and the stands are nice and even because you did a great job of planting the seeds, and you're conserving your moisture through mulch and everything, all your plants are happy, it produces joy, and it motivates you to do it, those first three principles, even more. But joy is also related to our relationship with the Lord. So we will always want to be paying attention to our joy level. And when that joy level falls, we want to reevaluate. Are we trying to do too much? Are we've somehow gotten out of our connection with the Lord, because the joy of the Lord is our strength. And basically, in the basic student lesson, we just kind of go through these same principles, talking about the importance of profit, and talking about how profit is not this it's not a transfer of wealth at the expense of other people, but it's a multiplication of value that we can share with others. It is increase, and it can be measured not just in terms of money or other things, but also in terms of just health or well-being or relationships or a lot of other things. And those are the things we want to be looking at in our lives. God measures our faithfulness in terms of the growth that he sees, kind of like the parable of talents, right? Did they increase the talents that they were given them? And those are the convicting things, where for me, it's not just like, is your marriage as good as it was last year? Then you're being faithful. No, if I'm being faithful in my marriage, it should be better than it was last year in terms of growth, of learning to be a better husband. That's the measure. So the same thing with anything, we want to be evaluating. If we're not seeing increase, then it's probably an indication that we're not being faithful with what we've been given. So talking about just the importance in the basic lesson of planting on time, this is a graph of how if we plant late, our harvest goes down if we're growing corn. Doing things to a high standard. I love this quote from George Washington Carver: "When you can do the common things of life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world." And then with minimal waste, means we must not waste anything we're given, because and the way I would define waste is unnecessary loss. Like, we live in a broken world, right? There's going to be some degree of waste, but of loss, but it's unnecessary loss, something we didn't have to lose that we did because of poor management. And then with joy, and then the importance of starting small, proving your faithfulness with little first. And another great George Washington Carver quote: "Do what you can with what you have and do it now. No excuses." And just being grateful for what we have. All right. So now some of to briefly go over some of these more practical lessons that you can look in more depth into later. I'm not going to go into the faith foundations for planning at the moment, but basically in the planning session, the faith foundations for garden planning, we talk a bit about that wrestle of God wants us to plan as a result, in order to be faithful, but we've also got to trust God with our plans, right? It's the Lord's plans that will succeed. So that wrestle of not worshiping planning, but also planning in order to be faithful. And one of the things I normally try to share with people in this one is, some people are planners. We love to plan and come up with a plan, and others of us just kind of like to make it up as we go. But help people to understand the value of planning by saying it's merely answering the questions that you're going to have to answer anyways when you plant your garden, right? You're going to have to decide, Where are you going to plant stuff? What are you going to plant? When are you going to plant it? How far apart are you going to plant it? What's going to come next? All those things you're going to have to decide either while you're standing in the garden with your hoe and the seeds, or when you're sitting down and answering those ahead of time to the best of your ability, so that things are always going to change. But if you have some kind of plan, you can adjust it. And decision making is one of the most stressful things that we do. And if we can sit down and do some of those, just make as many of those decisions as we can ahead of time, it'll minimize the amount of decisions we actually have to make when we're in the garden, and it will probably help us to make better decisions. So this planning session basically simplified it into helping people plan their garden with 8 planning questions, 4 that relate to the garden, 4 that relate to the crops. So the 4 garden questions are: why are you planting this garden? Which is going to determine a bit of the decisions that we make. Is this an educational garden primarily? Is it primarily for my family to feed them? What's the purpose of this garden? Who is going to care for and work this garden? A garden it has to have a gardener, and you cannot plant a garden that requires 4 hours, per week. It says if you only have 4 hours a week 4 hours per week of labor available, don't plant a garden that will require 4 hours a day to take care of, right? So we need to think and match our garden to the labor that we have available of the people that are taking care of it. And then when we think about where we'll put this garden, we want to think about visibility and accessibility. If we want people to see our garden and we want to be able to get to it, we want to think about whether a 20 by 20 will fit. If we want to put a different size, sometimes there's the idea of a door garden, which is the garden is the size of a door, about 8 foot long and the 3.5 foot wide, that you can start with and eventually expand to a 20 by 20. You want to make sure you have plenty of sunlight and you're away from trees, that it's got good drainage, access to water for irrigation, and protection from wildlife and traffic. And then the 4th question about your garden is: how big and what shape will it be? So the standard is 20 by 20. But again, it can be you can apply these same heart principles in a lot of other sizes, but just this technique uses that to start with. So this is a well-watered door garden. If you're just one person, you're trying to get started simply, you could just do one bed that's 8 feet long, and it's going to be the same width as the other beds, or a 20 by 20. And we'll talk about the bed spacing here in the layout lesson in just a bit, but you got to decide what size and shape you want it. I actually have some plots out here by my house that, because the plot is skinnier than this particular, than 20 by 20, I have 3 beds that are 25 foot long. And so it's a 15 foot by 25 foot plot, which gives me about the same amount of square footage, but it fits the space that I have. Does that make sense? So you may have to adjust it a little bit and still work. Then the 4 crop questions. 1, who is this garden growing crops for? Right? I loved, I think it was Cynthia last night saying that they sat down and tried to grow primarily things that they wanted to eat. It's a good idea. and we don't grow a garden just to grow a garden. We grow a garden to serve people. We want to understand who are we serving and what is it that they are interested in eating. And then what crops are needed for this garden. Once we kind of know what people like, we got to pick what we're actually going to plant in this particular garden. And this is where we have an example of some simple rotations to teach people how to rotate crops, so we don't plant the same thing in the same place year after year. So we have 4 crop groups: greens, beans, fruits, and roots. Some of our first students showed me that those actually rhyme. So we have the roots at the bottom and the greens at the top, just like a plant, right? So if you're trying to remember it, you've got the greens at the top, the beans, the fruits, and the roots. And that's the way that these categories are. And so we've got cool weather crops and warm weather crops that go in each category. And then we underline the ones that are crops that, if you're really trying to address hunger, then these are kind of the higher calorie crops. Like dry beans are more of a staple crop. Green beans are more of a nutrition crop. So depending on what you're wanting to grow or what the purpose of your garden is, you might focus more on nutritional crops or crops for hunger. If somebody's starving, you don't want to grow a plot of lettuce. It's just, it's not going to give them the calories they need, right? But if people have plenty of calories, but they're missing nutrition, then you might want to focus more on leafy vegetables. So we're going to use these as a way to categorize, to organize the crops that we're planting. And again, you can use a different rotation. This is just an example to get you started. And every year, if we have our beds 1, 2, 3, and 4 every year, our green leafies, we're going to move to the next one. So we have greens, beans, fruits, and roots. So first year, we'll have group 1, greens. Next year, we'll have group 2, beans. Next year, we'll have group 3, fruits. And the next year, we'll have group 4, roots. And it'll just make its way around the garden that way. And that's where we'll decide where to plant each of our crops. Again, if you break the rules a little bit, no big deal. You know, sometimes you need to plant carrots and there's another spot in your garden that's available at the time. You can do that. But in general, we're trying to keep it categorized so that we can make sure that we are rotating those different crop families. And then when will you plant your crops? This is one of those timely things. Lettuce grown in the spring will be happy, but lettuce grown in the middle of summer in Alabama will be grumpy. So we want to think, where will the particular plants be the most happy in terms of growing seasons? And that really depends on our area. So we have this blank sheet in the Well Water Garden Handbook so that you can talk to local gardeners, local resources, and find out what are the dates that work best in your area. And succession planting is one of those things where there are some plants that are better to plant a little bit throughout the season, so that rather than having a feast or famine situation, you can continue to eat fresh vegetables out of your garden. So to create your garden plan, you just pick your garden crops. And if you can see, we have a blank plan, but this particular plan here I have filled out as an example. So each of these rows represents a bed. So bed 1 is going to have group 1 this year, and I'm going to put kale and cabbage and broccoli and turnips in 1/4 of the bed, and I wrote down the planting dates. The next bed's all going to be sugar snap peas, and they're going to be planted on this date. And if I have this plan and then I put these dates on the calendar, it's pretty simple to look at February 4th and say, oh, that's when I'm going to plant the sugar snap peas, and I go out and I know exactly where they're supposed to go. So it allows me to implement that plan if I have my map like this and then my calendar. So we have some blank ones on here you could print out if you wanted to use that. All right, so and then after we plant our garden, our first step in actually putting in the garden, this is the first lesson for hand application, is what we call eating the elephant. So this is no-till preparation of our plot. And the first thing we teach is we're modeling here, doing things to a high standard by helping people lay out their well-watered garden to a high standard. We use stakes and strings to put in a perfect 20 by 20 and use a sheet of paper to square up the edges. Simple, but gives us a way to be excellent. And we try to make it match the site, so where it lines up with a road or a building that's nearby. And then after we do that, let's see where we have. Our options are to remove the weeds with either a hoe, just chopping it off at the ground. At the ground, we're not digging, and then either leaving those as mulch or removing them, which is what we typically do with a vegetable garden. Remove them and then reapply them after the fact. And or you can smother them with the tarp and leave it on there for a bit, and that'll kill the weeds off as well. And you can also use, you can just pull them by hand, and that's often the case when you are turning, going from one crop to the next. Sometimes you can use animals as well to eat the elephant. But this is a really a great way to teach people how to do an overwhelming task with joy. So you section off small bites of your garden, and then you, if you're doing it with a hoe, you sing and you do it with great joy while you eat one bite of the elephant, and you show how doing it with excellence, one little bite at a time, gives you the motivation to want to do another bite. Whereas if you had tried to tackle the whole plot all at one time, then it would be way beyond your joy level to complete, and you probably get discouraged and stop. So it's one of those, we try to teach this idea that you want to stop while you still have joy. So try to, whether it's this or another project, when you're trying to tackle things, try to maintain your joy level and take a break and not burn yourself out so that you don't want to come back tomorrow. Noxious weeds and creeping grasses, those I think Miss Allison was talking about. She has some of those. It takes a lot more patience to get those out because you really need to have a no tolerance policy, and it just means that you want to really start a much smaller garden and completely eradicate the weeds by hand out of that plot before you expand it. And thankfully, you can move faster than weeds can grow. So as long as you have a small enough garden, you can keep on top of them. So a lot of things about having joy in this lesson here. I'm going to share. Yes, I'm going to share really fast a few pictures. There we go. So here's at our farm. We are laying out a garden plot here that we're going to begin to eat the elephant. This is just Alabama red clay and grass. And so we've laid it off and we're beginning, well, actually we're cleaning up some old beds there. So we've laid it off here and now we're beginning our first bites of the elephant and eating that with our hose just right up at the surface of the ground, removing those grass off of the plot. And it's actually pretty quick. This is some friends of ours doing it in England. And so that's what that looks like as far as removing it with a hoe. These are bigger, heavier field hoes. And again, we're just scraping it off of the surface, not trying to dig those plants up. And it really goes pretty fast and is a lot simpler than a lot of other ways we could do it. Okay, so I'm running short on time here, but let me go ahead and go through. So compost and fertilizers here is sometimes these are lessons that you might or might not do. You might do a whole class just on compost, but compost is something I really encourage you to take the time to learn to do because it helps people to be able to have healthier soil and not be dependent on some fertilizer. So basically, we are creating a combination of, sorry, I'm not sharing my screen with you. We're creating a combination of organic matter, microorganisms, organic matter and microorganisms that we're adding back to our soil, because if we think about that, those three ingredients of healthy soil, organic matter, minerals, and microorganisms, typically poor soil just has the minerals, right? Just the clay, just the sand. So we're going to add back those two missing ingredients, the organic matter and the microbes. And that's what compost is. So we just share that compost is really that layer between the organic matter in the soil and the minerals underneath. That's kind of, it looks like compost, right? It's where the decaying leaves meet the clay or sand, and it's a layer of activity. That's where all the food is produced. And so when we apply compost, we're going to put it right on top of the minerals, right on top of the dirt that we have, and then we're going to put our mulch on top. So it's always sandwiched between the mulch and the dirt. Does that make sense? That's where you don't want to dig it into the dirt. You want to put it on top of the dirt under the mulch. And then most of all the roots of your plants will be growing in that layer, just like they do in the woods. The feeder roots in the woods are right there in that surface between the mulch and the dirt where all that decomposition is happening. And that's just what we're mimicking when we make compost. So I'm not going to go through that whole lesson right now, but I'm going to show you a few pictures of what that looks like when we're building it here so that you can get an idea of what that pile is like. Help me, Lord, help this to work here. Here we go. There we go. Okay. Share this. Okay. So this is, whoops. Yep, you can see that. So here we build these piles in just simple bays that are have stakes around them to be able to hold up the corners of the piles. And we turn them. Here's some of our students, some ones that our students made. And we use just our green material, brown materials, and nitrogen materials. And we have more resources. And again, you can read the lesson on exactly all the process of making that, but it's pretty simple and easy to do and creates a good, consistent supply of compost that is different than a lot of our composting methods where we're just trying to get rid of stuff. That's nice, like the backyard composting stuff. But if you actually need compost for your garden and you want to create a lot of it in bulk, the thermal composting method that we talk about in this lesson is really the best way to do it. And we also talk about a few liquid fertilizers for leaf production with a chicken manure tea, comfrey tea for fruit production, and making compost tea as well for just general plant health that you can make and use as well. All right, so then let's talk about our garden bed preparation. Go. And so I think, so Marianne asked, what do you put in compost as you create it? So I wish I had more time to go into all the compost. We'll try to maybe do a class just on composting, but what we're doing is we're just stockpiling materials, materials that are cut green, materials that are cut brown, and then some kind of nitrogen. And then when we build the pile, we're assembling it all at once, and we don't add anything after we finish building it. We only add it to the stockpiles to store up material for a future pile. So that way, all the material is the same age when it's finished in that compost pile, and it works really well. It's a pretty easy system. All right, so lesson 9, garden bed preparation. Again, some of these practical lessons, we have faith foundations and some biblical principles that go along with them, but we're just going to focus on the practical lessons here since y'all could go and read those later. So in this particular lesson, we're going to talk about marking out the beds once we actually have the plot laid out and weed-free. And the planting beds in a typical well-watered garden here are 3.5 foot wide, or 42 inches, or 110 centimeters. And then the paths are 1.5 foot wide here in the middles, or 18 inches or 40 centimeters. And then we have like a half path on the ends because, each bed and path adds up to 5 feet. And so 4 of these equals 20 foot, but we split the difference on the end for a half path instead of having one of the beds butted right up against the edge. And then what this does is it just gives us a place to walk and a place to plant, which is really valuable when we are growing vegetables. In a field situation, we can just have a blank slate and just plant rows, and it's not necessarily worth putting beds in, but for vegetable gardens, we find that it is. On the end here, you can see this bed layout string. What we do is we will make a string with beads at the corners of these beds. So you'll put, make a string that's 20 foot long or 6 meters, and you'll put a bead at the after 9 inches, and then count 42 inches and put another bead, and then 18 inches and put another bead, so that you have all the, you're not having to use a tape measure to find all these measurements every time. And then you put stakes at the corners and you pull your string, and then you know exactly where your beds are supposed to be. And you can use that string over and over again in the future to find out exactly where your beds are on that particular plot. Then what we do after we put these strings on the sides, we'll put stakes at the corners of all the beds and run strings to mark where the paths are. And we don't want to make like raised beds per se, but we normally take the paths, we level the beds a bit, and then we take the dirt from the paths, just about an inch or a few centimeters of that topsoil, and we dig it up and we put it on the planting bed. What that does is it just makes sure that if water is going to sit in our garden, that it is not sitting where the plants are growing. It's sitting where the walking path is. And it just makes a little bit of a difference between the growing area and the walking area, so that it ensures that those growing beds drain well. So then in here it talks about how to make a measuring string. After we lay off those beds, we're going to apply compost. And if we have enough, so there's two things. If you have enough compost when you put your garden in, broadcast it and put it on there and then put your mulch on. If you don't, put your mulch on, and then later when you plant, open up the mulch and put your little bit of compost that you have where you plant. So there's kind of like the generous or the like, focused way of applying compost depending on how much you have available at the time. Either broadcast it initially or put it where you plant when you plant. Different kinds of mulches. I really prefer grass mulches if I can on a bed because they don't, grass doesn't tend to move around as much. So grass clippings or weed-free hay or something like that, that's not going to sprout. Leaves are good, but if a lot of times they can blow around. And so I tend to use leaves only if I have big crops like squashes or something that, are far apart and they don't mind if the mulch is kind of blowing around a little bit. Wood chips and bark, I do not recommend them for growing beds, only for the paths, because if they are too fresh, then they can cause, they can tie up nitrogen and keep your smaller vegetables from really doing well. If you put them on your growing paths and let them decompose for a season, they will keep the weeds from growing on your paths. But then the next year, you could actually take that compost of wood chips and then you can put them on your beds. So a lot of people with the Back to Eden, they use wood chips, and I think if they're decomposed enough or you have enough decomposed layers there, it can work great. But for people first getting started, there's a lot of ways you can mess it up. And so we just recommend keep your wood chips on the pads and use grass or leaves on the beds. You can also use just rough compost as a mulch if you don't have super hard rains like I do. And use your mulch skillfully. All right, I'm going to stop this and show you a few pictures of this. Bed preparation, yes. Awesome, we have a lot of pictures of this. Okay. Share screen, here we go. All right, so there we have our planting string here, and we're putting in our stakes at the corners of what will be our beds. And then we pull our strings, and you can see here we're removing the little bit of soil from where the paths are, and we're putting them on the growing areas. Raking it nice and smooth so it's nice and level, so that when we're planting later, you don't have all these dips that make it hard for you to get a consistent depth for your seeds when you're planting them. Then with this, we had enough compost, so we applied compost on the growing bed areas. And then we came back and we applied mulch. This is some just grasses that we cut on our farm. It's really great if you can get your own material from your own site, it's been sprayed or not sprayed with, and that's really awesome. Then when you're done, you water it, and that just activates everything, activates the whole system. All the microbes and all come to life once you water it when you're done here. Here's some of our students and some of the beds when they were putting them in. Here's some work we were doing at that community garden locally. Here's us making the measuring strings. That's a good thing to do with a class, is to make those strings with the beads, and people can take them home with them. Just a few more pictures of our bed layouts here. And if you want to be funky and cool, and different, you can swap up your bed layout. We had one group of students, they wanted to do something different, so we did these diagonal beds here. So a little bit harder to measure and manage it, but it looks kind of neat to have it laid out that way. These are my sons helping me. They were dressing up like hobbits, and we were out raking some grass from a neighbor's field that he was cutting, and this is one of the ways we can get good mulch. Just stored up in our barn or feed it to the animals as hay. So here's us applying compost to that diagonal bed when we put it diagonal bed plot. And there's recommendations for how much we apply in the manual. Typically, it's like 3.5 wheelbarrow loads per 20-foot bed or per 6-meter bed. If you have enough, that's just a good initial application rate. If not, you can use what you have. But here's us applying that initially. We had this other plot, which is pretty cool. It's the students, we designed it to be like a leaf. So it's kind of like a design of the veins of a leaf branching off. So it looks like it has all the beds are just divided by that kind of leaf design. You can see that. So it's a fun plot to plant in, 20 by 20. And then in some cases, if you're doing a class like here, we didn't have enough space for a full garden. So we just did a 20-foot wide by 10-foot long, gave us the ability to still, demonstrate the layout and all, but allowed us to do it in the space that we actually had available. So does that make sense? The bed layout and how we install the beds? Anybody thumbs up? Yep, pretty simple. Great. Share. Okay, so how deep should the compost be ideally? Let's see, we got a few of these questions. So the compost, we're normally like about, again, the thing about compost is it's a fertilizer factory. It's not fertilizer. So it's gonna make the fertilizer for your plants. So when you are applying it, you want to think about nature. I mean, like there's not a foot or 2 feet of compost, in natural creation. There's often just a little bitty bit. But I normally go for, if we have 1 inch or 2 inches, that's a good generous amount, but less than that, even a 1/2 inch is a great, starter. Let's see. Rough compost, Cora, is where it's not as decomposed and fine. Like fine compost is like coffee grounds, Rough compost is chunky. Still, you can see what it is. So chunkier compost makes better mulch. If it's already like coffee grounds in a sense, it will wash away pretty easily. And then yep, you can use a stirrup hoe. As far as getting ready this spring, even if you don't have compost to apply immediately, you can, use some other kind of, liquid teas to get your stuff started. Go ahead and get in a garden with your mulch, and then you can figure out some kind of, and while you're building your compost pile, and while you're getting your compost ready, something to add to feed those plants while the system's getting going. But compost, we're jump starting the system. Even if you just have the mulch there, it's eventually going to be creating its own compost if you're adding that onto there. But if as far as getting started this spring, I think you should be able to find something you could put on there and be able to sense how we would get the compost ready in the compost. Yeah. So you would have your compost is going to take 8 weeks to make. So you may still actually have time to make it. If you can make your compost in a barn, you could have a pile ready in 8 weeks. So you still have plenty of time this spring to get a compost pile started. It might be the first thing you want to do is make a compost pile. There's some resources on the Academy for making compost, but also I have my friend Josh. He has the School of Traditional Skills, and they came and shot a compost class this last April, and I've never seen anybody that's done such a good job with creating a class from content. And so if you really want every detail about how to make the compost like I do, if you go to this, look up School of Traditional Skills, and they have my compost class on there, and that's gonna be like a really, really good way to learn that. But we got, highly recommend School of Traditional Skills. I'm going to get to go out and see them in Idaho in June and be part of a conference the homesteading conference out there, teach some compost in person. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about planting your garden. It's a mysterious thing for a lot of people. It's like, how do I plant into something that doesn't have, like, this, not this like fresh, bare dirt, loose thing. But it's actually pretty simple. And the main thing I want you to kind of get here is our is our spacing system. Because it's so simple, I think it'll really be helpful for you. In this lesson, we talk about selecting good seed. You can read through, you know, later about open pollinator versus hybrid versus heirloom. We're trying to demystify some of the different seed options that people have, and really try to say that, you know, don't stress over that too much. You know, I'm not a fan of GMO for sure, but if you're not ready to save seeds and everything right away, hybrids are a great option for a small backyard gardener. And you can still save seeds from them. It just ends up being a breeding experiment. So the first thing we want to talk about is our spacing system here. So we've simplified the spacing so that instead of having to remember measurements for all the crops, how many feet apart, how many inches apart, how many centimeters apart, every crop is either a 1-row crop, a 2-row crop, a 3-row crop, or a 5-row crop. Okay. So if you're looking at this, making sure I'm, sharing the screen here. So if you look on the far left here, if we're going to have 1 row, and we have a 3.5-foot bed or a 110 centimeter bed, it's going to be right down the middle of the bed. And then if we have 2 rows, these outside 2 rows are going to be about 30 inches. It's actually going to be out to 28 inches apart, or I think this is 75 centimeters apart. And then you do all 3 of these if you're going to do 3 rows, and then you split the difference again to do 5 rows if you are planting a 5-row crop. So what we do is we make a stick here. It's going to be a piece of pipe or a stick or whatever, and we mark on it. Sometimes I'll use electrical tape, or you can just draw it, and you have these 5 marks on it. If it's the US measurement system, it ends up being 7 inches between each one. And for metric, it ends up being kind of a weird fraction, but it's just you're taking 75 centimeters and you are splitting the difference in the middle and splitting the difference again with your marks. The beauty of this is because we're going to talk about terminology of it's either 1 row, 2 row, however many row crops, is whether we're using metric or imperial systems, we'll use the same terminology. You'll just have a metric stick and I'll just have an American stick, but we're still talking about the same spacings. And yeah, you can mark your hoe handle as well, is a great way to do that. So up here, this is the planting stick, and shows the dimensions of it and everything. And this, we call this between 2 marks a 1 in-row space. So I'm going to show you in just a second the planting kind of chart, and each crop is going to have by it how many rows it is. Is it a 1-row crop? You know that you'll just put a stake right here at the end of your bed, and you'll run a string down the middle of your bed, and you have 1 row. If it's a 2-row crop, you use these 2 marks. If it's a 3-row crop, you use all 3, that kind of thing. But then once you're ready to plant it down the row, we will have written in there, it'll be 2 spaces, for instance, like or it might be 3 spaces or 1 space. And that means as you're planting down the row, so let's say you pull your string, and if you lay this stick then going down the row, you can use these marks to space the plants as you set them out. So if it's a crop that's spaced 2 spaces apart, you'll plant one at 1 mark, you'll count 2 spaces, and you'll plant it at the next mark. And that is a really easy way to do your in-row spacing. For things that are seeded a lot closer, it'll say X many seeds per space, which means between the 2 marks, you will put that many seeds. So it may be 6 seeds. It may be, if it's a smaller one, 15 seeds, but you just kind of estimate how many seeds it takes, for that many, and you can dribble those out between the marks and work your way down the row. And then especially if you're working with kids or people that haven't planted for a while, they love a system. You're like, take this stick, put 6 seeds in between each mark all the way down, and they can do it really fast, and it looks like a machine did it. It's so beautiful. So let's talk about this, is the planting chart, that I would recommend printing this off and laminating it if you want to be able to have it to refer to. So column A here has our crops in it. So basil or bush beans or pole beans or broccoli. And then the next column B tells you which group it's in as far as those rotations. If you remember, we had greens, beans, fruits, and roots. Well, if you want to just know which if you have, oh, well, this is my group 2 bed this year, it's easy to look at these crops and say, oh, beans, pole beans, they're part of group 2. And you don't have to go back and find it on that other list. The next column C tells you whether it's a warm or cool weather crop, and whether the next one D, whether it's recommended to transplant it or direct seed it. And then column E here is where it's the number of rows. So this is where it's going to relate to that stick. So for instance, basil, we plant 3 rows of basil, and we'll use the outside marks on that stick and the middle one. Bush beans, we use 2 rows. We're going to use the outside 2 marks on that stick. Pole beans, we're going to plant 1 row down the middle. Okay. So for instance, because we're transplanting basil here, it's 3 rows, but in row spacing, that column F, it's going to be 2 spaces apart between plants. So we're going to put it at 1 mark, count 2 spaces, and put it at another mark. Now, bush beans here, we're planting them a lot closer together. So that means in between every space, we're going to put 5 seeds down that row in 2 rows. Does that make sense? Is that making sense to everybody? Hopefully it's, not too complicated. But if you can see, so then just the other columns are like, are you going to thin it? For instance, like beets, we will put them at 7 seeds a space every, 7 seeds a space, and we're going to thin them to 4 plants per space. Then succession planting, and we typically ask, some things like basil, you plant it once and you'll harvest it all year long. So we don't recommend succession planting it because it'll keep coming back, right? But like arugula, if you like that, you can get a couple harvests, but it grows fast. You want to, instead of planting your whole section of arugula in your garden all at once, plant a little bit every few weeks and you'll keep it coming in. And then this is a helpful column I. If you're having to buy or start plants, for instance, basil, per 20-foot bed or per 6-meter bed in your plot, this is how many plants you would need based on this spacing for 1 whole bed of that crop. Okay, so I was doing some calculation the other day in the garden, in one of our gardens, and I knew I needed like 1.5 beds of basil, 1.5 beds of broccoli. Well, what I was able to do is say, well, how many broccoli plants fit in a bed? Okay, 50. Well, if I'm planting 1.5 beds of broccoli, that means I need 75 plants, right? So it makes it easy to do planning when you can look at this column and know generally how many plants fit in a bed, and then you can just, multiply or divide that to the percentage of the bed that you're going to be planting, if you're planting a 1/2 bed of it or 1.5 beds. And then the last one there is the suggested amount of a 20-foot bed to plant. And this is, all this is for new gardeners. It's giving you a general indication of how much of a bed you should plant of a particular crop. For instance, radishes. Some of us love radishes, maybe, but it's not like the most popular crop in the world, and you can get a lot from them. So I recommend, planting 1/8 of a bed of radishes if you're going to be planting radishes for starting in a well-watered garden. Do not plant an entire bed of radishes, right? Because it's going to be way more than you can use and probably eat. Or if you're going to plant peppers, maybe plant 1/4 of a bed. So just in general, for an average family or person, this is about how much you might want to consider. So sweet corn, though, you don't want to plant just 2 plants. You really want to plant a full bed if you can, because that's going to give them the right pollination. So these are just some starter quantities of how much you might want to plant of a particular crop if you really don't have any basis to go by. But this is not like a rule. It's just a helpful starting point. But the neat thing about this crop chart and the way we're using this planting stick is, if you notice, there's no metric or imperial measurements on here. It's just all based on that planting stick. So if you're a metric person, or if you're an American, imperial or British, we can use the same sheet, right? And it works either way, because it's not based on an actual metric measurement. All right. Makes sense? Okay, let me just say, we're just going to go through a few pictures here of how to plant, and I think we will be able to take a break because we only have about 30 minutes until our next class, and I need a little bit of a break here. All right, so I'm going to pull up a few pictures here of planting and let you see what some of that looks like. All right. Share screen. Here we go. Okay, so here's an illustration of a little bit of different methods of how we would plant. So for instance, if we are, this is a broadcast application of that compost, if you see closest to us. So if we have enough compost, we can rake back the mulch and put it on the whole plot. If we don't have as much compost or we're planting it later, if you can see down there, we're planting 2 rows. We just open up the mulch and we're going to put the compost right where we're planting, okay? And at the end, there's some little holes there where we're planting, you know, like some squashes down the middle of the bed, and we just put it where those squashes are going to be. So you can see right there, those little holes. So those are kind of the 2 different mulch applications. This is my son working to plant his carrots in his garden. So he's doing the 5 rows in his little plot. And as you can see, he's pulled the 5 strings here, and he's using a little soil knife to scratch a furrow, and he's going to be planting his carrots there and then sprinkling the mulch back over it. Because this is the thing. If you're doing 1 row, 2 row, or 3 rows, you can open the mulch up down each row. But if you're doing 5 rows, you have to take the mulch completely off the bed, plant the 5 rows, and then sprinkle it back on top, because you can't open it up, you know, that fine with that many rows. So that's one of the biggest differences between with the 5 rows. Here he's planting an individual. This is what you know, 2 rows looks like if we're planting corn. It's going to be that far apart. And the neat thing about this row spacing is the outside 2 rows are the same distance from that row to the next row and the next bed. So it matches actually the field spacing if we want to plant field crops. So here, yeah, if we're going to be planting here in our gardens corn, we're doing 2 rows, and we're just opening up the beds every, trying to see what my spacing is for that. Yeah, so corn, every 3.5 spaces, we're putting 3 seeds, and then we're thinning it to 2 plants. So that's what that's looking like for planting our corn out. And if we're planting out transplants, we're just we're going to prepare the bed first, and then we're going to plant them straight through that mulch, just with a trowel, just opening it up, just like you would plant out flowers in a flower bed, really. And we'll pull those strings across to show us what our spacing should be. Here is us planting some beans later, just 2 rows down, open it up, and we're planting the beans down. And then we're going to kind of pull the mulch back around it a little bit. But you can see if we're planting onions here, we can just stick the onions straight through the mulch when we plant those and transplant them out. Here's some of the students. This was why we don't use leaves. We didn't have any grass, so we used some leaves initially, but these leaves blew all over the place, and we had quite a problem with them. So I ended up having to bring a load of grass to put over these beds. Here's a trick, though. If you have leaves and not very much grass, put the leaves down and then sprinkle a bit of grass mulch over the top, and the grass mulch will lock in place and stabilize the leaves underneath and keep them there from blowing away. That's what I ended up doing with these plots. And then there we were planting pumpkins out. Here's Enoch planting out the cabbage plants. Actually, this cabbage I showed you yesterday is one of those plants right there that he's setting out. So he actually pulled all the mulch back and planted them. And then I was like, well, you know, you probably could have put the mulch back on and planted them through first. He forgot about that. So we ended up having to tuck all the mulch around the plants, which took a little bit longer. But if he had put the mulch back on and then planted the plants through them, then it would have been a little bit faster for him. All right. Well, hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of how we put in a well water garden, how we plant it. I've got some more pictures of finished gardens, and we'll talk a little bit about garden care in the next session. But thank you so much for being so patient as we went a little bit over on this one. But I hope it was gives you a little more of a picture of what some of this looks like, hands-on. And we will see you guys in about 30 minutes in the last session. So I'm going to go eat some oatmeal for breakfast, and I will see y'all in just a bit. So God bless. See you soon. And yeah, we'll see you then.